My voice was steady as I stood in the church parking lot, the cold air a welcome shock against my skin. The phone felt heavy in my hand, a conduit to a world my family couldn't even imagine. "This is Special Agent Keller," I said, my tone low and devoid of all emotion. "I have an active, unsecured admission of Title 31 violations from the primary target." I paused, my eyes fixed on the stained glass window where I could just make out a silhouetted figure at the pulpit. "I am invoking Protocol Nightingale. Execute the warrant. Now." But 10 minutes earlier, I was just Jane, the disappointing daughter. The air inside the church was thick with the scent of lilies and hypocrisy. I sat in a hard wooden pew next to my husband David, a good man who believed my family's polite fiction. That's when my brother Mark, the family's golden boy who wore his legacy like a crown, swaggered over. He leaned in, his cologne overwhelming, a smirk playing on his lips as he looked down at me. Well. The failed soldier decides to show up. The nickname landed like a physical blow. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the cold weight of a lifetime of being second best, of being the footnote in my own family's story. It was the same tone they used when I washed out of basic training with a career-ending injury. Not concern, but a quiet, satisfied confirmation of their low expectations. Mark then clapped David on the shoulder, his voice dripping with condescending confidence. "Don't worry, we're taking care of Grandpa's legacy, making sure to structure the flowers carefully, just like he taught us." He winked, and I heard the muffled snickers from my aunt and uncle in the pew behind us. That was it. That one phrase. It wasn't an insult, it was a confession. The years of quiet observation, of piecing together fragments from my other life, all clicked into place with the terrifying certainty of a locked door. All the anger I had swallowed over the years didn't explode. It went cold, turning into something hard and sharp and clear. I grabbed David's arm, my grip so tight he flinched. "We're leaving," I said, my voice a low whisper. "Now?" I didn't look back. I just walked, pulling him through the heavy doors and into the clean, cold air, leaving the entire rotten structure behind me. He thought it was just another jab, another reminder of the daughter who couldn't cut it in the army. He had no idea he'd just confessed to a federal felony in the language of his trade. To understand why the FBI was about to raid my grandfather's funeral, you have to understand the lie my family had built their entire empire on. To them, my life was a closed book written in a language they couldn't be bothered to learn. This lie, this carefully constructed narrative of my failure, wasn't new. It was the foundation of our family. I remember a Sunday dinner about a year ago, the air thick with the smell of roast beef and my brother's ego. The entire evening was a celebration of Mark, a toast to him for landing some massive contract for the family's so-called high-end logistics company. He sat at the head of the table, across from my father, holding court like a king, recounting tales of his business acumen while my parents beamed with pride. It was a performance I had seen 1,000 times. At some point there was a lull in the conversation, and I saw a small, foolish opening. "I got transferred, by the way," I said, my voice sounding small in the sudden quiet. "To a new federal department. It's a big step up." For a fleeting second, I allowed a flicker of hope. Maybe this time, they'd ask a follow-up question. Maybe this time, they'd see me. My father, a man who measured worth in stock prices and public perception, took a slow sip of his wine. He didn't even look at me. "Another government desk job," he declared with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Safe, I suppose." He then turned his gaze on me, his eyes filled with that familiar, weary disappointment. "It's a shame your army career didn't work out, Jane. You could have been something." The failed soldier. There it was again, dropped so casually as if it were my official title. The words hung in the air, and nobody corrected him. The internal ledger in my mind flipped through its pages. The congratulations I never received for graduating at the top of my class at Quantico. The student loans I paid off myself while Mark got a down payment for his condo. The way they called my injury a convenient excuse to quit. All of it was present in that one dismissive sentence. I just smiled faintly and pushed the food around on my plate, my silence the price of admission to these family gatherings. Later that evening, as I was getting my coat, my mother, a woman who treated family harmony like a sacred text, cornered me in the hallway. Her expression was pleading. "Jane, please," she whispered, as if we were co-conspirators. "You know how your brother is, he's under so much pressure running the business. And your father, he's just so proud of the family name." She was asking me to shrink myself yet again, to fold myself up small enough to fit into the box they had built for me. I was to manage my feelings so they wouldn't have to manage my brother's behavior. I simply nodded. It was easier than explaining a truth she had no interest in hearing. The very next day, my world shifted from their opulent, suffocating dining room to the cold, silent reality of mine. There was no fine china or crystal here, only the sterile hum of servers and the stark fluorescent lights of a skiff, a sensitive compartmented information facility, buried deep inside the Hoover building. In this room, there are no family dynamics, no golden children, no failures. There is only data, evidence, and the mission. I stood at the head of a long conference table, the faces looking up at me belonging to seasoned federal agents and stone-faced prosecutors from the Department of Justice. Among them was my direct superior, Assistant Director Carmichael, a man with eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for being as tough as the cases he prosecuted. Here, I wasn't the quiet daughter. I was the lead agent. My voice was different here, clear, confident, and precise. The subject organization uses a classic layering methodology, I explained, pointing to a complex diagram of wire transfers on a large screen. Initial deposits are structured to avoid triggering currency transaction reports under U.S. Code Title 31. I used the words, their words, the jargon of criminals, but I used them as weapons. From there, the funds are funneled through a series of offshore shell corporations before being repatriated as legitimate payments to their primary front company. I clicked to the next slide. It was a corporate flowchart, an organizational chart. And at the top, under the heading Primary Subjects, were two names, Robert Keller and Mark Keller, my father and my brother. I felt a strange sense of detachment as I pointed to their pictures, my voice never wavering. For the last 18 months, Operation Legacy Loss has documented a pattern of systemic money laundering. The room was silent, every agent focused, their respect a tangible thing. They didn't see a failed soldier. They saw the architect of a major federal case, the one person who knew the enemy better than anyone else. They saw me. For years, I kept my two worlds separate to protect the investigation. But my brother's arrogance in that church wasn't just an insult. It was a tactical error. He gave me the live, probable cause I needed. He thought he was speaking in code, but he was speaking directly to the one person on Earth who held the key to his cage. The moment the car door slammed shut, sealing us off from the funeral, the dam of my husband's confusion finally broke. "Jane, what was that?" David's voice was tight with panic, his knuckles white on the dashboard. What did he mean? Structure the flowers. What is happening? He was looking at me, his wife. But the woman who looked back was someone else entirely. The years of practiced patience, of biting my tongue and swallowing my pride, had vanished. In their place was a cold, hard clarity, the kind that only comes after 18 months of painstaking work. This wasn't a rash decision fueled by anger. It was the culmination of a strategy, a moment of perfect, terrible opportunity that my brother had handed to me himself. His arrogant whisper in the church wasn't just another insult to be added to the ledger, it was the final piece of evidence. It was the live, unsecured confession I had been waiting for. My intelligence had suggested that the transfer of the physical ledgers, the paper heart of their entire criminal enterprise, was to happen under the cover of the funeral. My brother's words confirmed it. He had just turned our grandfather's memorial service into an active crime scene. While David was still trying to process the slight, I already had my phone to my ear, my fingers scrolling to a single secure contact. My voice was level, my breathing steady. All the emotion was gone, replaced by pure procedure. "Carmichael, this is Keller," I said, my gaze fixed on the church in the rearview mirror. Target just gave a verbal admission in a public setting. "I have reason to believe the primary evidence, the ledgers for Operation Legacy Loss, are on site." I could hear David's sharp intake of breath beside me as he heard the case name for the first time. "I believe the transfer is happening now," I continued, my focus absolute. "I need authorization to execute." There was a brief pause on the other end, the silence of a man weighing the career of his agent against the certainty of the intel. I could practically hear his question, the standard challenge. "Are you confident, Keller?" 100%, I answered the unspoken question, my voice like iron. He used the specific terminology. "This is it." The authorization came back, crisp and final. The tactical team, which had been on standby for this very possibility, was now on the move. Protocol Nightingale was a go. The machine was in motion. My instructions were clear: maintain distance, let the entry team do their work. I was the lead agent, but this was my family. The lines were blurred, but the mission was not. The warrant was signed weeks ago, waiting for the right moment. My brother thought he was presiding over our grandfather's memory. He had no idea he had just become the star of a federal sting operation, one that I had personally designed. I watched from the threshold of the church, a ghost at my own family's funeral. Inside, my brother Mark stood at the pulpit, basking in the warm glow of the sanctuary lights. He was giving the eulogy, but it wasn't for our grandfather. It was for himself. His voice, slick with false sentiment, spoke of a legacy of integrity and building something that lasts. He spoke of family values and hard work, and I felt a cold knot of nausea in my stomach. In the front pew, my parents sat, my mother dabbing a tear from her eye, my father looking on with stern pride. They were all so proud, so deeply invested in this beautiful, prosperous lie. They were mourning the loss of a patriarch, completely oblivious to the fact that they were about to lose everything else. The main doors of the church opened without a sound. It wasn't a dramatic crash, but a silent, deliberate push. A half-dozen men and women in plainclothes filed in, their movements economical and purposeful. They didn't run or shout. Their presence was a quiet declaration of authority that was far more intimidating than any show of force. The mourners in the back pews turned, their hushed whispers dying in their throats. One of the agents, a woman I knew from the white-collar division, discreetly showed her badge to the priest, who froze mid-prayer, his face a mask of confusion. The lead tactical agent, a tall man with a calm, unreadable expression, began a slow walk up the center aisle. The quiet, inexorable advance was mesmerizing. Every step he took seemed to suck the air out of the room. Mark, blinded by his own spotlight, finally noticed the interruption. He stopped his eulogy and squinted into the crowd, his annoyance plain to see. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dripping with the condescension of a man who had never been told no. "This is a private service." He might as well have been talking to the wind. The lead agent didn't even glance at him. His eyes were fixed on the front pew, on my father. He stopped directly in front of my family. "Sir," he said, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of the federal government. "We have a warrant to search these premises." Mark let out a loud, incredulous scoff. The sound echoed in the silent church. "On what grounds?" he demanded, stepping down from the pulpit as if to confront the agent himself. "This is harassment. Do you have any idea who we are?" It was the desperate cry of a man whose power was evaporating before his very eyes. The lead agent finally turned his gaze from my father to my brother, a flicker of something almost like pity in his eyes. He lifted the radio to his mouth. "Special Agent Keller, we are on site," he said, his voice clear and steady. "Confirm the primary target." That was my cue. I took a single step forward, moving out of the shadows and into the light of the doorway. The phone was still pressed to my ear. A prop in a play I had spent a year and a half writing. Every eye in the church turned to me, the forgotten daughter, the failed soldier. My brother's face registered a flash of confusion. My voice, when it came, cut through the suffocating silence, as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. Confirmed. "The primary target is Mark Keller. The secondary target is Robert Keller, my father." The change in my brother's face was a slow-motion catastrophe. The arrogance drained away first, replaced by a deep, furrowed confusion. Then his eyes darted from me to the agents, back to me. The gears were turning, desperately trying to connect two impossible realities: the sister he had dismissed his entire life, and the woman who now commanded a federal raid against him. The confusion curdled into dawning comprehension, and then, finally, into a wave of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at me, and for the first time he truly saw me. And he was terrified. My father made a sound, a strangled gasp, and his face went ashen. He wasn't just looking at his daughter, he was looking at the architect of his ruin. He slumped forward in the pew, a great, fallen oak, his entire world demolished by a truth he had refused to see. As agents moved in to place my brother in cuffs, another agent walked calmly to the pulpit. He picked up the large, ornate family Bible, the one my grandfather used to read from. With a quiet click, he opened it. But inside, there were no sacred scriptures. There were only the neat, meticulously kept columns of a financial ledger, the secret history of my family's success. The proof of their sins, hidden inside their performance of piety. My brother laughed because he thought I had failed to earn a uniform. He never considered I had earned a badge instead. In the end, his entire criminal legacy was brought down by one word he thought was an inside joke. The aftermath of a storm is always quieter than you expect. The picturesque church was now wrapped in the stark yellow of police tape, a crime scene where a family's legacy had just been pronounced dead. I stood on the asphalt, the flashing lights of the unmarked cars painting the twilight in strobes of red and blue, debriefing with Assistant Director Carmichael. Our conversation was calm, procedural, a world away from the emotional wreckage behind us. He nodded as I spoke, his eyes showing not surprise, but the quiet confirmation of a long and difficult case brought to a successful close. From the corner of my eye, I saw them being led away in separate vehicles. My father, looking shrunken and old, and my brother, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. I felt no surge of victory, no thrill of revenge. Just the heavy, somber finality of a necessary amputation. My husband David approached me then, his steps hesitant. He looked from the departing cars to me, his face a canvas of shock and awe. "An FBI agent?" he whispered, the words barely audible. "This whole time?" For years I had carried the weight of that secret, a wall between the two halves of my life. For the first time, I could finally let it crumble. I gave him a small, weary smile, the first truly honest one I'd given him in years. "It was need to know," I said softly. "Now you know." In that moment, the immense burden of my double life simply evaporated. I was no longer Jane the failed soldier and Keller the federal agent. I was just myself, whole and complete. 6 months later, the view from my window wasn't of a church parking lot, but of the Capitol building. The air in my office was different. It smelled of ambition and purpose, not lilies and decay. A simple silver plate on the door read, "Jane Keller, Unit Chief, Asset Forfeiture and Financial Crimes." The promotion had come swiftly after the successful prosecution of Operation Legacy Loss. My life was no longer about reacting to my family's narrative, it was about writing my own. I stood before a class of new trainees, their faces eager and hungry for knowledge. I spoke to them about financial forensics, about the patience required to unravel complex criminal networks. My voice was steady and authoritative, the voice of someone who had earned their place not by birthright, but by merit. After the briefing, I grabbed coffee with my team, including the lead agent from the raid. We laughed about a bureaucratic snag in a different case, the conversation easy and filled with the shorthand of shared experience. These were my people now. This was my family, one built not on obligation and a hierarchy of affection, but on mutual respect and a relentless dedication to the truth. There were no golden children here, no invisible ones. There were only colleagues, peers, and an unspoken understanding that your worth was measured by your competence and your character. It was a foundation of granite compared to the sandstone my old family was built on. I finally understood what it felt like to be seen for exactly who I was. One Tuesday morning, a letter arrived. The postmark was from a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania. It was from my father. My hands were steady as I opened it. There was no tremor of anxiety, no flicker of old fear. I was curious but detached. The letter wasn't an apology, not a confession, not even an explanation. It was just a single, bitter question, scrawled in his familiar, arrogant handwriting. Was it worth destroying your own family? I read the words over once, twice. It was the last ghost, the final attempt to reframe his crime as my sin. The old Jane would have agonized over that question, the weight of the accusation crushing her. The old internal ledger would have filled with guilt and doubt. But that ledger was closed now. I stood up from my desk, walked to the industrial-grade paper shredder in the corner, and fed the letter into the slot. The machine whirred to life, turning his final, poisoned words into meaningless confetti. I didn't watch it fall. I simply turned back to the schematics of my next case, my real work, my earned legacy, which was waiting for me on the wall. My father believed a legacy was a secret to be hidden. I learned it's a truth to be defended. He called me a failed soldier, but a soldier's duty is to protect their country, sometimes even from their own family. If you've ever had to define your own success on your own terms, tell us your story in the comments. In this community, your true rank is always respected.